Welcome back to Mythic Dungeon International as we're getting ready for our upper final series between Buff War, Nerf Rogue, and Team D. These are also going to be our highest point earners in the East, meaning the Transmorpher Beacon and Horde Alliance Fireworks very well could be funding their prize pool if they do qualify. Hey, I'm Jack, and joining me right now for our next series, we've got Zyronic, Nagura, and Tettles. And my friends, we're getting started on the Underrot. The first one, and this should hopefully, Zyronic, make for the shortest dungeon we've seen in quite a while, because the next two are sure to be quite long.
Well, also, Underrot was one of their time trial dungeons, so
that's true too.
They have a good job and good practice on this dungeon, and considering these are our top two teams as well, they have really good times in this dungeon as well. They're within 10 seconds of each other in terms of their time trial time.
That's right, and this has definitely been one of the shorter dungeons we've seen, around that 15-30 mark thus far going into it. So, Buff War, Nerf Rogue, they switched it up a little bit in terms of their tanks previously, Tettles, but you think that was just more of a very niche pick for Borealis itself to take advantage of that Sigil of Misery, work with the spotters as well?
So I saw at some points Buff War, Nerf Rogue were actually playing the Vengeance Demon Hunter inside of the Underrot, but for their best posted time, they actually didn't play it, but busting it back out. So something.
And we got a Mistweaver action coming in as well. Alrighty then. And keep in mind, both teams here are going to be playing Hordes, so we're going to be getting some very cool action.
We need to be watching out for how Buff War, Nerf Rogue actually ends up dealing with the Kragmaw room. They actually do an insanely large pull with Sigil of Chains and Sigil of Silence there.
And something we talked about yesterday as well, like you mentioned as well, because Prot Warrior is so good in this dungeon for the Spell Reflect on Elderly Axel alone, it almost makes up for having any other tank, so they have to have some really good reason for playing Vengeance Demon Hunter in this dungeon.
Oh, I'm excited for this one. It's going to be game one in the upper finals. Let's get it going in the Underrot.
Wow, okay, so this is going to be an exciting one. We actually do have a bunch of diversity here when it comes to the comps. We see that purple color, which again, purple is my favorite color, so definitely vote. I am for Buff War Nerf Rogue here. Sorry to say I'm biased, but Team D, on the other hand, also running this Mistweaver, so I know Jack is definitely rooting for that one.
Already a very large pull coming out here, but here's the thing. The Demon Hunter can't actually do anything here except for just do its AoE damage, AoE healing, because the Tides doesn't let any of the sigils actually work until it's gone. That being said, massive amount of self-HPS, 120k self-HPS coming out of the Vengeance Demon Hunter here. And on top of that, it's keeping up with the Outlaw Rogues and damage too. These Demon Hunters, when they do these mass pulls, can do a lot of damage. And, credit where credit's due, the Unholy DK popping off like it normally should do on those massive AoE packs. That just looked really good. But on the side of Team D, they did they did the same trash pull, but they just did it faster, and they're already on the Axo with the Bloodlust. So, we're talking a lot about the Vengeance Demon Hunter, but the Prot Warrior just kind of did it a little bit better. Maybe that has to do with having the Mistweaver in there as well.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the reason why Mistweaver is actually viable here in Underrot with this strategy is that they actually have a DK with the Battle Rest, right? So you don't need your Raster Druid to provide the Battle Rest. And then also in Underrot specifically, the Disease Dispel, which Mistweaver can do and the Raster Druid cannot do, is actually so valuable, just because those Lashers later on, if they get a cast through, then you can actually dispel it with the Mistweaver instead of having to heal the Absorb away. And then on top of that, on the third boss as well, there's also diseases that can be dispelled. And on top of that, just having the Paralyze and having the Ring, really good in this dungeon in general. We see Team D actually saving the Bloodlust for the boss, same as Buff War Nerf Rogue, and you can see just how much damage this DK is doing again. DK just definitely very strong here.
Yeah, look at the damage coming out of the Vengeance and the Resto Druid as well, both doing 30k single target DPS for Buff War Nerf Rogue, whereas on the side of Team D, they're only doing 27, 23k respectively. So just all around team play for Buff War Nerf Rogue on this boss, they're doing a ton of damage, but because of the efficiency of that first pull for Team D, they're just slightly in the lead right now. We'll have to see how that changes going forward. One of the advantages that I think Team D has over Buff War Nerf Rogue is they have access to that Ring of Peace, which is going to be really, really good for kiting around the Feral Bloodstormers and Kragmaw's room.
Yeah, and you also have the Spell Reflect, right? Which just means that the first boss is going to die faster just because of this huge Blood Bolt that you can Spell Reflect back onto the boss. Or you can one-shot or almost one-shot the Mirror Image with the Spell Reflect, and then the rest of the DPS don't have to put so much damage into it. Now, Team D and Buff War Nerf Rogue, same percentage when it comes to enemy forces, but this is a huge pull actually out of Team D here, as they pull a bunch of emissaries together and a bunch of Bloodswarmers. You can see 3 of them even, as we had 2 fixates on Long and 1 on Mog. This is insane.
Yeah, and you can look at the amount of healing that the Mistweaver is pumping out, over 100k HPS, but the Unholy DK doesn't care. He just goes straight through 700k DPS on that giant pull, and that was both of the Tides emissaries gone. They don't have to worry about interrupts for the rest of this room here.
Okay, that was just insane. They just pulled more than half the room together. They didn't care about the emissaries. They didn't care about the... Okay, so we talked about this multiple times, how difficult the mobs are in this area because of the Blood Swarmers, because of the Fixate, and you don't really want to pull 2 of the Blood Swarmers at the same time because, you know, double Fixate can be a thing. But they pulled 3 of them, and we see Leota actually going down as Buffalo and Nerf Rogue also had 3 Blood Swarmers being pulled at the very same time. Leota unfortunately had 2 Fixates on him and went down to the damage, but they did have a DK as Supreme to actually get him back up, so they were back into it. Didn't lose too much because of it.
Yeah, Buffalo and Nerf Rogue actually just did a little slightly bigger pull, which is, you know, they managed to have that death because of it. They're 4% ahead on trash percentage because of that, but Team D has already kind of started finishing off their second trash pull. And we've seen this, I mean, Buffalo and Nerf Rogue was the team that I was keeping an eye on during time trials, and they did a lot of different iterations of how they were pulling this room, and this was the safest way they could come up with doing the room. They tried doing the entire room at once with Kragmaw with their Unholy DK jumping up to, I think, 1.4 million DPS, some ridiculous amount like that. But I believe on their safest pull they had like 2 deaths trying to pull that off. So it was something they deemed not viable at all. But, you know, maybe with more practice into the future we can see teams actually pulling that off. Maybe with some different combination. The Unholy DK seems like it's kind of has to happen for
double Unholy?
Maybe double Unholy, you never know. But, I mean, and then, yeah, right, just is exactly what they were doing on their practice team times as well. You know, and you see Team D doing the exact same thing. They do 2 massive pulls, and then with that last pack that's on top of the Enchanted Emissary, you just pull with the boss, you let your Outlaw Rogues and your Unholy DK do their work.
Yeah, so Buffalo and Nerf Rogue, I mean, they were behind right after the first boss, but at this point, they're pretty even. You can see the trash percentages even. They're both fighting Krogma. They're very even at boss DPS as well. So both really close. You can see the Mystery actually dropping really low because of the Fixit of the Blood Swarmer here, but he should be able to recover. Now, Ring of Peace actually really nice for the Blood Swarmers, right? Just because even if you have multiple Blood Swarmers fixate you at the same time, once you put down this Ring of Peace, he's not going to be able to reach you. Now, on the other hand, Vortex and Typhoon are not actually as good as the Ring is, just because Vortex only triggers 1 time, and if you're too far away from the Blood Swarmer, he will charge or leap on you, which Typhoon can help you for a little while, but it will not prevent this leap. But the Ring of Peace does, because it procs continuously, right? The Ring of Peace is not only one use; it procs for the whole duration of it. Yeah,
I was kind of curious to see if Ching was playing the build that. So let's talk about the Vision of Perfection build with Gluttony, but it doesn't look like he's playing that. He's opting to use Anima Major instead, so a little bit of a safer, you know, more consistent thing. You're not just randomly proccing off metamorphoses here and there, but you know, kind of, I would have liked to see that, because, you know, one of the things he likes to talk about as well is Vengeance. Whenever their meta is up, they're pretty much indestructible. Have almost 1 million HP, a ridiculous amount of armor. You really can't go down, and on top of that, all of your damage dealing essences and abilities as a Demon Hunter, they also scale off of your max HP, so that's why you could see him bursting for as high as the Outlaw Rogues on some of these massive AoE packs, because they have that ability with Metamorphosis just to kind of do crazy amounts of damage, and you can see that meta is popped right here when they pull trash into the boss.
Yeah, I can see a lot of times that the Vengeance Demon Hunter is doing a lot of AoE damage, as you mentioned, with this meta up. So definitely keep an eye on the damage meters whenever the Demon Hunter is doing those huge pulls with the meta up. You can also see both of those teams actually did pull the Skeleton packs, the Guardian packs on top of the boss here. None of the affixes are actually preventing them to pull anything on top of the boss, like there's no Sanguine, there's no Bolstering, for example. Volcanic, not a huge deal for those teams, and teaming, of course, doesn't prevent to do that either. So definitely a heads-up play for them to do this efficient play and killing the Guardians on top. Now, it is a lot of tank damage, as it is a Tyrannical boss, and you have to deal with all of the Guardians, but they're doing a good job surviving here.
Yep, and looking at the time trial times once again, I mentioned they were 10 seconds off, and that's honestly that's RNG. RNG can determine that 10 seconds. And as you can see right now, these teams are pretty much neck and neck. Buffalo and Nerf Rogue, you know, maybe 15, 20 seconds slower here, but like I mentioned once again, it could just come down to proc RNG and doing damage at that point, and maybe having that extra death during their first initial trash pull. Team D very slightly in the lead here, but with how close these teams are, any one small mistake can definitely make up that difference instantly. And I mean, waiting for this pad timing here, waiting to put this pull together, when Buffalo and Nerf Rogue probably isn't going to have to do that, that'll close the gap for them for sure. Yeah, definitely. And you can also see Team D doing a pretty huge pull. They do see the Emissary in the back here. You can see the Emissary of Tides being blinded in the back. I assume they're going to put one more CC on top of it now before it reaches the pack. Okay, they do not. So now the Emissary of Tides is in. So they cannot interrupt anything anymore. They have to be very careful here because of the Defilers having cast. And you see 2 debuffs actually on U-Claps here, as the Death Speaker was putting the Wicked Frenzy
directly on the Guardians, but the Euclipse is being able to recover here as he's just kiting, because all of the Guardians, they just have all of those Wicked Fancy debuffs on the Enrage effect on them. Now again, they're playing Blood Elves, so no Shadow Melt available, but they can dispel this shield from the Guardians, and that's why you can see their Arcane Torrents being on cooldown of the Mistweaver and of the Rogues, just because they constantly dispel these shields that are coming off. While Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, they're all the way on Sancho already, fighting trash with the boss.
Yeah, they skipped all the trash between Kragmaw's room and Sport Collar Zancha, and the strategy that they used to pull these two Guardians, dropping very low, they had one of the mushrooms left, everyone has that debuff on them, but it looks like they're going to be totally fine. That was a little scary moment for them there. We see some teams opting to sap the Emissary of the Tides and kill the Guardians on their own, and then move into the boss with the Tides Emissary. They sapped and then rooted the Emissary of the Tide, but they just pulled the two Defilers on top of the boss and cleaved them down while getting interrupts. So that's just another variation. It's a little more efficient cleave strategy than we see from other teams in the West when they just decided to kill the Defilers on their own and then moved with the Tides into the boss. They're just opting to cleave all three down with the boss, just albeit at different times.
Yeah, and you can see, to be honest, Team D did pull the boss later, but they actually caught up quite a bit on boss DPS. It is a tyrannical fight, so even smaller percentages mean quite a lot in HP, but still, Team D just showing how much single target damage they have. Also, I saw that Long did have the army ready, so definitely boss timing is nice for them as well. Army is a 10-minute cooldown, but it does do so much damage for the DK, so it's very nice to have it out for those bosses, of course. And you see Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, they pulled those Guardians and the Death Speakers on top of the boss now. Now Ching is gonna get a lot of damage here, but he's in meta, so he should be fine.
Yeah, the meta just wore off, though. It's not that long of a cooldown for Vengeance, and I think it's only like 12 to 15 seconds, something very short duration like that when you're in that Vengeance spec, so it ran off almost instantly, but the pack is almost dead at this point. They did get a fresh Guardian spawn, unfortunately, from the Death Speaker. It looks like it went off, so that's not great, but you know, it maybe could have been on purpose for a little bit of extra single target damage for both the Outlaw Rogues and the Unholy DK. Not quite sure on that one, but you know, we'll chalk it up to being on purpose, because I like building up the teams a little more. Let's say they wanted more extra single target DPS and they want to cleave it down too for more efficient damage.
Yeah, one more thing to note, that having the Mistweaver means that you don't actually have to soak any of those mushrooms at all if you don't want to, because of Revival, right? Which we've just seen happen for Team D. Of course, they didn't leave all the mushrooms up, but there were some mushrooms that they just didn't soak, they didn't care about. It saves you a couple of seconds, right? Because otherwise, the Rogues would have to go there with their cloak and soak them up. It's not going to cost you a lot of damage, but everything matters, especially if those teams are so close, because when the mushrooms go up, they do apply the disease on everybody, but because of the Revival, it will just be removed and they're going to be fine, as we've seen before. Now, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue is slightly slower on the boss, but this is just a game of seconds here. I
mean, if you look at the boss 2 kill timer versus the boss 3 kill timer, they made up about 15 to 20 seconds here. These guys are literally neck and neck, 1% behind in trash count. They're probably going to pull the exact same mobs with maybe one small discrepancy in what mob they pull. So it's going to be interesting to see who can just be more efficient for the rest of the dungeon. We already mentioned it. We keep mentioning it. Their time trial times were only 10 seconds apart. So, I mean, you can already see they're kind of doing a similar pull. They both pulled a large pack of all the skeletons to that worm on the side, on the right side. It's not going to be quite enough trash for them to finish off the dungeon. I'm pretty sure they might need to pull 1 or 2 more mobs in to finish it off, and then they'll move to the last 2 corruptors at the end of the dungeon on top of the Emissary to finish off the trash count. But, I mean, Team D is looking a little bit more efficient right now, but it's just still neck and neck right now.
It's definitely very close between those two now. Both of those teams are probably going to save the Bloodlust for the last boss, which is something we've seen a lot from those teams, even though they don't have the Reaping anymore, right? With the Reaping, it made sense for the Bloodlust to be saved on the last boss because you pull the Reaping on top. Now without the Reaping, teams still choosing to save it. Now Tyrannical does make the last boss quite a bit more difficult, so maybe that's the reason why. And also DK is scaled pretty well. Their single target damage does scale pretty well with the Bloodlust, especially if they do have their cooldowns ready. Now, 94% for both of those teams. They both have their Bloodlust, but Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue does have 1 death. You have to consider that. It's 5 seconds difference as well. So if a game is this close, it might actually matter in the end.
I mean, like we mentioned, 10-second difference time trials, that 5-second death timer is absolutely going to matter. On top of that, Team D is more than likely going to be on the boss before them just because of how efficiently they've dealt with all of this trash. It's going to be neck and neck at the end, you know, unless one of them decides to, you know, somehow randomly wipe at the end after having such a clean run.
It's going to be, I mean, the odds of them wiping the last boss are very slim, but in case something does happen, Team D only has one Battle Rest player in the group, it's the DK, right? While Bafor and Nerf Rogue has 2. So in case something goes wrong, if the DK dies for Team D, they can't get him back up. Anyone can die in Bafor and Nerf Rogue, and they will be able to get them back up. Well, unless 2 people die, of course, but we don't want that to happen. Now, I guess it's all going to be down about damage now. It's all going to be about those damage meters. Take a look at the damage meters, see who can pump the most damage between those 2 teams.
I was keeping an eye on the timers as both teams pulled the boss. Bafor and Nerf Rogue pulled the boss 11 seconds after Team D, plus that 5-second death timer means they're 16 seconds behind, so they have to come up with 16 extra seconds worth of DPS on single target out of nowhere, which on a 2-minute 30 boss encounter, which this is probably going to be, that's a ridiculous amount of extra single target damage, and that's going to be the difference between the damage we saw from the healer and the tank on the first boss. But right now, Euclaps and the Mistweaver Monk are doing more damage than Loyola and Ching are doing right now, so Team D looks like they have a firm advantage right now, and they're already halfway done with the encounter. They've already gotten halfway through the second blood phase right now.
It definitely looks like Team D is ahead. I just want to mention one more thing about the energy bars that we did add here, or the resource bars rather, on the boss frame. So you can see the Unbound Abomination does have this red rage bar basically, and all the damage you do to the boss does get reverted into this rage or energy bar, and once it reaches 100%, you will have those ads spawn that need to be killed, and once they are killed, the boss will lose the HP. So that's why you don't see the HP moving constantly. Now we see Bafor and Nerf Rogue still, I mean, they're slightly behind, but this is such a close game between those 2, and both of them played very clean, which is so refreshing because we've seen lots of teams have very big problems in those dungeons and mess up a lot. So Team D and Bafor are showing that they are really good teams.
I mean, this is so close neck and neck right now. Team D had a really unfortunate timing on their boss's spawn. They were sitting at 100 energy for a long time there, and due to the boss's cast sequence, they actually didn't get their blood visages for about 5 extra seconds. That being said, the boss is going to get to 100 energy way before Bafor and Nerf Rogue for Team D. The final set of blood visages will spawn very far in advance, and I mean, these teams they both improved on their times from time trials by about a full minute. And if you had any doubt in your mind that these 2 teams weren't the best 2 teams in the East, I mean, take a look at this dungeon. These guys were both almost perfect in here.
It is actually incredible. You can see even Bafor and Nerf Rogue spawned the last blood visages at the same time. I mean, Team D winning, but only by a couple of seconds. This was so good by both of those teams.
Team D really stepping up and showing what they can really do in this Underrot. Massively improving onto their time trial there. That was a great dungeon to watch there, Tuttles.
Yeah, that was actually insane. And those teams were within 10 seconds of one another for the time trials for their Underrot dungeon, and they were really showing why with these very clean runs from both of these teams coming out today.
Yeah, and even just being able to look at the differences a little bit here and there in routes. I mean, Underrot's pretty much on the rails as we take a look at it, but being able to show the diversity between the Mistweaver Monk, the Vengeance Demon Hunter, that was a real treat.
Yeah, so the Vengeance Demon Hunter, play didn't actually feel like it was actually insane just because of how this is like a Tides-heavy Underrot dungeon. A lot of times you'd be looking to see some like super nice use of Sigil of Silence, but it felt like Team D and then like the Prot Warrior damage from Euclaps just felt like it was a little bit more with how it ended up shaping up. Team D and Bafor Nerf Rogue were both very close neck and neck whenever they were actually in the Kragmaw's room, with Team D just a slight advantage. Team D kept this slight advantage and propelled it in towards the end of the dungeon. Bafor Nerf Rogue actually did something very interesting on Sporecaller Xancho with their healer running off, pulling all those reanimated guardians plus that Emissary of the Tides into Sporecaller, which actually could have been very dangerous for the tank if actually not dealt with correctly. But at the end of the day, Team D showing up in like the Mistweaver Monk, the Ring of Peace was actually it was used very well by them as well. So it was actually very nice to see both of these 2 teams really be neck and neck.
And showing where these teams are going to be able to start excelling. And when we talk about routing, Method Dungeon Tool has been a great tool for it. And looking at how Bafor Nerf Rogue stepped up in Kragmaw's room, as you mentioned before the match.
Yeah, so it was very interesting to see. So basically, Bafor Nerf Rogue almost ended up pulling about double what Team D actually ended up doing in Kragmaw's room. So they actually ended up pulling like all of these mobs, just leaving like this little bit last few mobs in the back to be able to be dealt with just one pull, and they ended up like grouping them right here. So we can actually see in the clip how the Vengeance Demon Hunter actually jumped like across the room using its mobility with Infernal Strike in order to be able to very quickly group up all of these mobs. You actually see him using a Lightfoot Potion out of the Shroud there as well, and then he's just ending up running around, getting all the mobs grouped up as quickly as possible, going into meta, and then just making sure that he's able to tank all the way through it. You also do see the healer from Bafor Nerf Rogue running around in Tree of Life form, which is actually very good against the Feral Bloodswarmers, because if the Feral Bloodswarmers were to actually target the healer, then the healer would be pretty much as good as dead.
Yeah, at that point, they're also pulling the tides in, and they're having to deal with some of the decays coming out, for example, from the lashers, or they have the frontals from the maggots. So it's a lot of pressure onto the entire group to watch what is happening, where all the different mobs are facing. So very well played on their part, but Team D definitely pulling through there. So we'll be taking a quick break before we dive into our next series. You're not going to want to miss this one, as we'll be back after a short break. Team D is up 1 against Buff 4 Nerf Rogue as we're getting ready for our next game in the series. It's going to be King's Rest. And guys, we've seen some King's Rest be very, very messy so far. But Volcanic, Skittish, Fortified Titles is about as easy as the affixes start getting here.
I mean, Shadow of Zul is still pretty dangerous even on
I've seen a lot of tanks die to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because it is this fortified setting, Shadow of Zul is one of the most dangerous mini-bosses in the game. It has to be killed, so there's no way that you can skip around it. So we're definitely going to be seeing how teams end up dealing with that. Something that's also important to note is that the animated Guardians now give a little bit more percent coming into the season. So we're seeing some teams like elect to pull all 4 of the animated Guardians at the very beginning of the dungeon with the suppression slam. That can actually be very dangerous. So it's going to be important to note that kind of stuff watching the beginning of the instance here.
But in many cases, when you're having an easy expectation as to where all the slams are going, it just kind of operates another quick rotation between tank goes one direction, melee goes another, you just keep on spinning around.
I was thinking about this because, like, there's some severe optimization that can still be done in King's Rest, especially since we saw all the changes to how, for instance, the Guardians work in this dungeon. This 4 Guardian pull that we saw Black Mamba try yesterday, why wouldn't you just pull, like, 2 of the Guardians with the boss and then the other 2 Guardians with the gauntlet later on and, like, just take an entire pull out of the dungeon in general? Like, why haven't teams tried doing that yet? I feel like that would be way more efficient than what we saw
with
from
the
anyone
boss
so far. Yeah.
True. Yeah, that will work, I think.
I mean, you would have
to get rid of the Shadow of Zuls first.
Yeah, it would be weird. So you would end up, skipping past them first, doing all the regular trash, then going back, bringing them to the boss, and then you have to go all the way back to the start of the instance.
It's not really that far,
Just the healer, though, right?
Well, it would just be the healer, and you don't really have to deal with the Zuls because they can just tag them with, like, a Moonfire or something, and then they can shadow melt off the Zul adds once the tank has aggro on the Guardians. It could totally work.
Yeah,
That's
I like that.
We've seen a lot of the golems, for example, already being pulled into the what was it, the gauntlet room, for example. And they were just running all over the place. They were just slamming in all kinds of different directions, and they had no problem doing it there.
I would be concerned with pulling the animated Guardians into the first boss just in general, just because of how much uptime your melee will end up actually losing on the boss. With like triple melee comps, you're going to get pushed off the boss by the suppression slam plus the big circle from the Golden Serpent. So you're shaking your head no.
Work,
you shouldn't.
I mean,
you can always make them focus on the tank. We saw a team pull it off yesterday.
Yeah.
If the tank's always facing away, you're never going to lose uptime.
Of course, you shouldn't, but in theory, it makes the first boss significantly more dangerous for the healer.
Sure.
Definitely. It's a lot of tank damage. If the teams had problems with it, those were tank deaths, right? Some teams had the tanks dying, so it's definitely a risk for the tanks. But we saw a team pull it off, so...
You can see that, but it's also a lot of, as Tettles mentioned, it's a lot of maintenance for the healer because they have to be jumping back and forth between pushing back or rooting any of the blobs that are coming out, make sure they're focusing any of the healing onto those melee who are running out to be able to drop their spit gold debuff. And then the tank is often going to be line of sighting or even outranging because he's having to watch for those frontals because he's going to have very narrow corridors to be able to work with there.
I think the Guardians also enrage like sub 50% or sub 30%?
They will be dealing a lot of damage.
Yeah, so and it's not like a dispellable enrage either. It's just like they start meleeing harder, so it can actually be very dangerous for your tank. We actually saw some tank deaths coming in from West Cup. So I think you're right. I think it is like the most time efficient thing, but I think it's also pretty dangerous.
I mean, when you're building these routes for these teams, you're always trying to figure out, okay, what's the least amount of efficient pulls we can do this entire dungeon in? And if you're able to pull off what we're talking about with doing the 2 Guardians into both the boss and the gauntlet, that would actually just cut out one entire pull. The question is if it's efficient and you can do it 100% of the time. If you can't, you just scrap that and go with something else.
Yeah.
We'll have to see the end of that. And it's also a very good point because it allows you to start skipping more and more later on into the instance there. So we're going back to our default stance in a lot of ways. No more meme
so much yellow. I thought, oh my god, new classes. Then unfortunate.
And then King's Rest happens. That's how it goes sometimes. But I'm hoping we see a little bit more innovation into those strategies, into those routings. Because as you guys mentioned, we haven't had the best combinations, the best routes just yet. And we'll see if they're going to start continuing to grow the meta as we get ready for King's Rest.
Yeah, so I just really hope we're going to see some very clean runs from those two teams, because we had a lot of fiestas, to be honest. So now that I've seen the Underrot from both Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue and Team D, I actually want to see very good strategies, and I want to see a very clean run by those two teams.
And there is a little bit of variation here for the two teams. We have the two rogues on the side of Team D running Dwarf, and we have the rogues on the side of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue running Night Elf instead. So the dwarves will be able to, use that Iron Skin or Fireblood, I believe, they're Dark Iron Dwarf, to get any extra debuffs off should they choose to, because they do have the Vanish that they can use for skips instead of Shadow Meld. So just an interesting choice here. Namely, I think the use we see for it is usually on the Council boss, that Severing Axe debuff that they usually use to get rid of. So we'll see if that's a problem for them later on. But right away, I mean, these teams are, we've talked about Holis's teams are same pull from both teams. Double pull with Bloodlust, lots of AoE damage to deal with here, especially in the fortified setting.
Yeah, these are super difficult pulls, and I like them using Bloodlust on this trash. I've been talking about this yesterday. Some of the other Eastern teams were saving their Bloodlust for the boss. On a fortified setting, I just felt like that's not worth it anymore, because the boss is not actually that difficult anymore on fortified, plus the nerf for Spit Gold coming in as well. So both of those teams committing their Bloodlust to this double trash pull, and we talked multiple times how difficult these pulls are just because of the Witch Doctors. The Witch Doctors constantly cast Deathly Chill, which, if not interrupted, does a huge amount of damage, magic damage to the tank, frost damage, I believe. And then on top of that, they also cast Shadowbolt Volley. So you need a lot of interrupts to go through. And then you also have the emissaries here as well, which makes it even harder to deal with those packs on top of it.
Yep, we see a big discrepancy in damage output here. We see Tomboy popping off doing 30k more DPS than everyone else. That's because he's a master outlaw rogue. He actually knows how to roll 5 buffs. So, I mean, that just kind of goes to show you what rolling a 5 buff actually does for your damage as an outlaw rogue. It's a very RNG class, so it's kind of frustrating to play. Ching dropping incredibly low to that blast that you're talking about from the Witch Doctor. That's a lot of damage. Not to mention, I believe the champion is also enraged as well. Fortunately, Loda was able to dispel that off. But man, there's a lot of tank damage going off in these trash packs.
Yeah, Team D also struggling a little bit with their pull, as they still had the Shadow of Souls around, and they were just charging in, getting feared. Now the fear can only be dispelled by the druid, as it is a curse, so could only dispel one of them, and of course the cloak was not available for Mog there. As Team D is fighting the last pack, and Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue definitely dealing with this room faster. They only have the emissary left in the corner here, the Tides, which they will pull on top of the boss here, just getting a very efficient extra percentage from the emissary of Tides here.
Yep, extra single target damage for the outlaw rogues, more double sinister strikes from the keep your wits about you trait, just a little bit of extra single target damage. You're not going to get it for that long. The Tides emissary is almost already dead. So we're going to see if they're actually planning on doing anything with the Guardians here, or if they're opting to save it later on. I kind of like a lot of the strategies we saw early on, where teams were committing to get more trash percentage, so that they could skip some of those nasty trash pulls on the bridge later on after the second boss. It looks like we're not really going to see that. We're probably only going to see from both teams at this point, because we don't see the healer from either team going off to pull the Guardians. They're probably only planning on doing the 2 Guardians with the Gauntlet, which is the more safer strat that we see from most teams.
Yeah, we definitely going to see the Guardians being pulled later to the Gauntlet, as you mentioned. To be honest, I mean, we did see the Guardians being pulled on top of the Golden Serpent 3 times, I believe, and it only worked at 1 time without the tank dying. So it's definitely risky. I mean, to be honest, those are the 2 teams who could probably pull it off, because Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue, and Team D definitely seem to be the best 2 teams out of this region so far, definitely showing up. So if anyone can pull it off in the Eastern region, then it's probably one of those 2 teams. So maybe they want to consider it for next time around. I definitely do like the strategy with the 4 Guardians being pulled on top of Gauntlet and Boss. Now, the Golden Serpent, I talked about it before, it did get nerfed, so the Spit Gold debuff that is on Tomboy right now doesn't do as much damage anymore as it used to, and it is a fortified setting, so really not a huge deal anymore. And this is why the Rasta Druids can pull out so much DPS. As you can see, both of them pulling a 23k DPS.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we had Tyrannical Quaking of this dungeon last cup,
yeah.
It was chunking for 70% of their HP, and if somebody had a Spit Gold debuff while Quaking went out, it was like, oh, watch his health bar, he's going to lose all of it here, and Rogue proc cheat death. It was good times. It was lots of fun to watch. It almost makes it a little cheaper now that it's only fortified and it got nerfed. But it's still something the healer kind of has to pay attention to. They still have to toss hots on them, but they are able to output a lot of single target DPS now. It's a little more involved for the healers instead of just having to pump out heals the entire time. That being said, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, they are cruising in this dungeon right now. They are way ahead of Team D in terms of where they are in the dungeon right now, and I mean, this is pretty promising to see, because they were very close in the previous dungeon, and so far so good for Buff4 Nerf Rogue. That being said, here we go. First 2 Guardians coming into the gauntlet room. This is typically what we see. These first 2 suppression slams, they can pretty much go in any direction because the tank doesn't have aggro on them yet. But once the tank has aggro, they will always face him with that frontal cone ability.
Yeah, this is just very impressive by Buff4 Nerf Rogue. Not only did they deal with the first trash room faster, they also dealt with the boss faster, and now they're already fighting the gauntlet while Team D just got there right now. So you can see the gauntlet actually not being RNG like it is on live servers on which group is getting activated, but it is the top left one, and then it goes counterclockwise afterwards. So they definitely know which group is getting activated at what time. Now, the second group is probably one of the most dangerous trash groups that here in this gauntlet, just because there's 2 named mobs. One of them casting AoE lightning needs to be interrupted by either the Ring of Peace or the Typhoon, or and there's also the X Barrage, which can only be delayed by stuns because it can be interrupted, but right after the stun wears off, the X Barrage is going to get casted again. You can line of sight the X Barrage, but that's very inefficient damage-wise, so usually teams just choose to take the X Barrage and let the healer out-heal it.
Yeah, usually you only see line of sights for X Barrage like in the Raging Affix or something ridiculous like that, where it will do 100% more damage, and you'll see people get very much chunked by that debuff. But you know, in these affixes where there's not that much to worry about and it's not even that much damage on the group, it's like maybe 20 to 25% per tick. They're able to heal through it. It only does 3 ticks of damage. It won't even 100 to 0 anyone on this particular setting with these affixes, so it's not something they're worried about too much. I mean, Buff4 Nerf Rogue, they've dealt with the Guardians, they've dealt with the second pack of mobs. Team D pretty close on their heels, but still, Buff4 Nerf Rogue, very, very, very firm advantage right now in this dungeon. I'd say 30, 45 seconds, something about that amount right there.
Yeah, most definitely. You can also see a little bit of a difference when it comes to talent choice between Team D's Resto Druid and Buff4 Nerf Rogue's Loda, as App is actually running Tree of Life, which we've seen a lot from the Eastern region. The Resto Druids in the Eastern region really like this talent, while we don't see it as much at all in the Western region. Well, Loda is not actually choosing to play Tree of Life at all. Now, I think Tree of Life definitely can be used if you do those kind of big pulls every once in a while where you want this extra cooldown to be used for, while Cultivation is just better for throughout the whole dungeon to keep constantly more healing. And it also allows you a little bit more to stay in cat form for longer, in my opinion, and do more damage, because you can apply HOTS before you go into cat form, and then Cultivation is just going to carry you healing even a little bit more, and you can stay in cat form longer before you have to switch out and heal. Well, with Tree of Life, you don't have this luxury, so you have to switch out cat form earlier and heal the tank or your players up.
And legend has it, every single time a healer, a Resto Druid picks Tree of Life, JB rolls over in his grave one at a time. Yeah, that guy, I mean, he doesn't like Tree of Life at all. He'll fill out any excuse to run Cultivation. I think it's a pretty interesting talent choice as well. I mean, you just kind of went over all the basics for it. So I feel like normally when we see Tree of Life picked, it usually means the team is gearing up to do some very large abnormal pull in the dungeon, usually with Bloodlust. And like there has to be a reason to take Tree of Life. We've talked about some of these choices that the teams make. Usually there's a very specific reason they take some of these talent choices or some of these comp changes, and hopefully we'll see it out of Buff4 Nerf Rogue. Maybe they plan on doing some massive pull on the bridge later on. Yeah,
it could definitely be the exact thing that you said, because Tree of Life, you know, if you don't play around it, or if your comp doesn't need it, then there's no way of running it, right, as you mentioned. So there definitely might be a huge bridge pull that we see later on, or maybe even something that is being pulled on top of the boss. But at this point, Buff4 Nerf Rogue very far ahead. They are already in Machimba's room. You can see both of the constructs and all the fluids being pulled here on top of the Emissary of Tides. You see Ching just using that shield wall to be able to stay alive here.
Yep, I mean, this is a pretty typical pull. We didn't see this last week from any of the Western teams because they had that bursting affix, so they wanted to make sure only the rogues were in the room when all the bursting went off, because they could just cloak it off. But because there is no affix stopping them from pulling everything in the room at the same time, of course, they're going to do what they can do, and they can pull everything at the same time. It's a little bit dangerous. You got to make sure your healer is not getting hit by any of those swirls on the floor, because that debuff will stack, and if it gets to 10 stacks, you can't move, and you're going to die to that poison debuff. That being said, it's only one person that has to move, and he can just kind of hot people on the run, so it's not that big of a deal for the healer to be kiting around. And Buff4 Nerf Rogue, they've dealt with all the blobs. They only have the 2 constructs left. And like we've mentioned, just strategy-wise, most of the time, if you pull them to the same time or the same side of the room, they'll always target the exact same tomb, and you can just spam click that same tomb to get people out. So just really efficient pull from them. They pulled it off cleanly. It looks like Team D's doing the same pull as well, and they're not having any troubles with it either. So, I mean, they're kind of maintaining that 30 to 45 second advantage in the dungeon right now. This is so close.
I mean, yeah, so Team D did pull all the fluids, but they just later pulled just one single construct. The other one they didn't touch yet. So definitely a little bit of a smaller pull without the constructs on Team D's side, but UClap actually committing that shield wall just for the fluids and the emissaries. So interesting to see that Team D is doing a little bit of a smaller pull here, while Buffwar Nerf Rogue just pulls the whole room together. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that Team D is slower, because they in theory could be pulling the constructs on top of the boss. So as long as they do everything in 2 pulls, then they're still going to be fine compared to Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. But it doesn't seem like they are going to pull it on top of the boss here. So definitely a little bit slower here as well on Team D's side.
And I kind of want to test the speed of these 2 teams. Normally, by the time teams in this eastern region so far have gotten to the second boss, their Bloodlust has been off cooldown by the time they pulled the boss, and we've always, discussed, oh, are they going to use Bloodlust on the boss? Are they going to use Bloodlust on the Trash Pact afterwards? Their Bloodlust is just now coming off cooldown on the side of Buff Warner with the boss at 30%. So I can say with absolute certainty they are not going to use their Bloodlust on the boss, and they're going to save it for Trash afterwards. Team D, we could talk about it if you want, though.
One more thing, though, because they also used their Bloodlust on the Trash, and most other teams were saving it for the Serpent, meaning they even used it later. So you can definitely see, as you mentioned, Buffwar Nerf Rogue and Team D a lot faster than what we've seen so far out of the eastern region. Now Team D, again, a little bit slower. It took them so long to finish off these constructs, to be honest. While Buffwar Nerf Rogue was just pulling the whole room together, just dealing with it so much faster compared to Team D, as they already down Machimba now, and now we might see a big pull coming out of Buffwar Nerf Rogue. Definitely interesting to see what they're going to do with this bridge area here. They probably are going to skip the Brood, but let's see what they do.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what they're planning on doing here. They've staffed the Tides emissary as well. They've got the Berserker stunned. And I mean, this isn't as big of a pull as I thought they would do. There's 2 Berserkers in here, which is absolutely what the Bloodlust is for. You got to keep an eye on that bleed debuff that's in the bottom left of Ching's frame right there. If that stacks to 2 or 3, he's going to be in big trouble. If it ever gets to 3, he's more than likely just dead, and they're going to have to commit the battle res. But fortunately, they do have 2 of those. And really, right now with the Bloodlust, it looks like they're pretty stable. One debuff goes on Ching there. Hopefully, the second debuff goes on somebody else, because that's what you'd like to see. It does leap away from him, so he's not going to get 2 debuffs. That's a very good management of the Berserker debuffs from Buffwar Nerf Rogue here. And even though he's taking a lot of damage from the Trash Pack, without that debuff, he should be totally fine. The other debuff went on the Druid, so he'll be able to heal himself up. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the first time this weekend we've seen that pull go completely clean for a team with no death.
It was definitely well done, and we've talked about this very same pull in the spring season. Most teams did pull off this exact same pull, but it was not fortified last time around, so it's definitely a difficult pull to do for those kind of teams. I think it's mostly just managing that is difficult on this pull, because yeah, the Berserker's bleed does do a lot of damage, and the casters, the Spectral Bolt does do a lot of damage as well, but they can be interrupted, right? So as long as you manage them properly, and as long as you execute all of the single target control properly, then you're going to be fine. And of course, you also need to see the Emissary of Tides, which we've seen some teams fail to before. But Buffwar Nerf Rogue not done with this pull, as Team D also used their Bloodlust to do this exact same thing. And now Buffwar Nerf Rogue actually engaging this Brood, which we thought they would, or I thought they would skip.
Yeah, usually when we see teams have their trash percentage from the Berserkers, if they're about 75-76%, that means that they're able to skip the Brute. That being said, that's 74% before they engage the first Berserker pack, so they do need to finish this off to get their percentage for the dungeon. They do have to commit one of their battle res to Morito going down, unfortunately, there, which is, I mean, this is pretty reasonable. This trash pack is nasty. Both of these Raptors do a lot of frontal cone damage with that leap claw that they do, and on top of that, there's a lot of downtime in general with the Brute doing his massive area of denial abilities, so they got that trash back down a lot quicker than we've seen other teams do. That's a lot of good focused single target damage from them, and I believe, like we normally see from most teams, they're going to commit at least one of their shrouds, maybe both of them, to getting to the third boss.
Team D struggling a lot on this pull. I mean, they didn't have any deaths, but they didn't get the CC done on the Emissary of Tides. And of course, the Tides Emissary makes all the mobs around it immune to CC or stun or anything like that. So they struggled a lot to get the CC off. UClap had to kite all the way back to Machimba's room, and whenever a warrior has to kite like that, or a tank has to kite like that in general, not only does the tank not do any damage, but the melees are going to do less damage as well, because everything is going to be spread out. You're not going to be hitting your cleave anymore. So definitely just losing so much time here on Team D's pull, because they were not having the same amount of control as Buffwar Nerf Rogue had on their attempt.
It's important to mention as well that we talked about this earlier in the dungeon, the Dark Iron Dwarf racial that they can use. They can actually use those to get rid of the Berserker bleed debuffs as well, so they could choose to take one of the debuffs for their tank and then use that racial to get off. We do see Uclep actually going down to this pull. They're going to have to commit their battle res, but that rogue has the debuff on him, and he still hasn't used his racial. He has it available. You can see the icon, the Fireblood icon. He hasn't used it yet. Okay, he used it after the debuff was gone. Okay, maybe there was some lag on the client. I'm not quite sure. You never know. It could just be a weak aura issue, but that looked very suspect. I mean, the debuff was ticking and he had it available. That was very weird.
Yeah, I agree with you. That was probably a misplay. He probably just didn't see. Now, we actually see Long go down as well, unfortunately. They do have a rest ready, so they could get him back up. But Uclep having 2 stacks going down as well, 2 bleed stacks. Just, they are not being able to control these kind of pulls. We've talked about this. I mean, those are super dangerous pulls, and now all of their DPS are down. This is probably going to be a full team wipe coming in, unless App manages to get a Shadow Melt off, which I believe he did manage to get it off, so he's going to be able to mass rest the group up. But this was a huge pull by them. I believe there's a brute in there. There's just so many trash mobs that they pulled together, and they were not able to get enough control, enough interrupts, having those bleeds on everybody, having the cast go through, having the spectral balls. It was too much for them to handle. Buff Nerf Rogue had a lot cleaner run, as they're already on Xanasal, which is the second boss in this council fight. They only have Akali left.
I'm curious to see what they're planning on doing here, because the safe play, in my opinion, will be just to go kill the third boss so they can get their checkpoint. Because with no battle reses up, you have no safe way to get back to this point instead of running through the entire dungeon. So the safe play would be to go to the third boss, get your checkpoint from killing the third boss, and then coming back and doing trash. You do have to backtrack, but they're already behind in the dungeon. I feel like you want to take the safe play at this point and hope the other team messes up. That being said, they go right back into the trash pack. And I mean, this is even more dangerous. There's no battle reses available this time. If they have another tank death, that's going to be a full team wipe. Ab doesn't have the Shadow Meld at this point to resave them again, so they have to be super safe here. However, on the side of Buff Nerf Rogue, they're already on the third boss in this council. It's about to go down. It's at 50%. They've dealt with the difficult part of the encounter, which is Xanazal.
Yeah, and this is a very good time. If you look at the final time right now for King's Rest, this is so good. So Buff Nerf Rogue definitely having a very good strategy, very clean as well. Just you know, it looks so easy how they pulled off the trash pulls right earlier. We said this is not as big of a pull as we thought it is, but then we looked at Team D doing the same pull and just struggling so much, just because this is so difficult on 45. Even if Skittish and Volcanic are not really an issue for those teams, because you know Volcanic can just be dodged, and Skittish is gonna be not a huge problem if you have a worry doing a lot of damage, and also have 2 tricks from the rogues as well. So definitely not a huge deal for those affixes, but 45 making this so much more difficult, and Buff Nerf Rogue doing an excellent job dealing with this, as they also pulled one more trash group here with an Emissary of Tides in it. So keep in mind, none of these can be stunned or succeed.
Trust me, guys, I know it looked weird what Lodo was doing there, but he did know there was a wall there. He was just trying to proc the cutscene from running through this door after he killed the third boss without being in line of sight of the Witch Doctors to get damaged. So just smart play again. They know how this dungeon works. They deal with that large trash pack with the tides cleanly. They only have to deal with this 3-pack in front of the bridge as well as the Shadow Azul, and then their trash percentage is done, and then they finish off King Desar. And they are so far ahead at this point in the dungeon that all they really have to do is play safe and play clean, and they should have this in the bag.
Yeah, this is so clean by Buff Nerf Rogue. I'm very impressed by their strategy and by their execution here. Very well done. Now, they do not have their Bloodlust ready for Shadow of Zul, so they will have to manage their defensives properly to make sure that Ching does not die here. If something goes wrong and they run out of defensives, in theory you can still start kiting this mini-boss here, but it's super dangerous to start kiting, and someone else could get aggro, especially in the Skittish affix. So we'll see how Buff Nerf Rogue does handle Shadow of Zul here.
All right, no caster curse. The tank will definitely not die to Shadow of Zul. They have a battle res available just in case, but I mean, we always talk about how difficult this Shadow of Zul encounter is, especially for prot warriors to deal with it. They don't have any very good way to deal with these shadow damage, magic damage in general, outside of their ignore pain, which is like probably only about an 80k absorb. So it's not that much to deal with, because these shadow barrages are definitely hitting a lot more than 80k. Let me tell you, you can see his health getting chunked for 30 or 40% every single time he gets hit. So hopefully it doesn't go down here. You could see Loda is absolutely just pumping him with heals, and I mean, Shadow Azul, it's not like it's mechanically a difficult mini-boss, it's just tank damage.
It's definitely just tank damage, and you can get a little bit unlucky on where those zones spawn that you need to soak. I mean, most of those teams are just outranging them instead of soaking them because it doesn't have a huge range, but it can spawn in a very bad spot, so the healer needs to run away, and if the healer runs, he can't really spam those regrowths, as we can see Loda doing right now. And you can see the HPS coming out of Loda on single target, basically. He was just spamming that regrowth, spamming those hots onto Jing, but very well done. They did have to use all of their defensive cooldowns, basically. You did use the Ironbark Shield Wall and Last Stand, so none of those left for the last boss. But last boss, usually not a big deal for tanks on a fortified setting. It should be okay for Jing to survive this.
Yeah, Buff War Nerf Rogue is absolutely shredding this dungeon. I think the fastest time we've seen so far this weekend from any of the teams has been in the 26-27 minute range, and they're on pace to get like a 22:30 or a 23 flat time as long as they keep steady pace right now. They're going to have their Bloodlust available in about a minute 20 seconds, which unfortunately I think is going to be after Tizala is spawned, so they're not going to have that up for the really dangerous section of the encounter. That being said, it is fortified. Both of the rogues do have Cloak available to cloak through that first Deathly Roar from Tizala as well, so they should be able to kill it before a second Deathly Roar gets off. Hopefully, I'd imagine they would. But, even so, it is in a fortified setting. I don't really foresee anyone going down to that. Once again, no caster curse. I don't see anyone going down to that at this point in the dungeon. These guys are they're playing so clean right now.
I mean, they probably know at this point that they are pretty far ahead because they can, of course, watch the stream if they want to. So I hope that they're just going to play it safe here at this point, because all that can wipe them here is a death on Loda, for example. So they want to be watching out. They want to be focusing down Riban, in my opinion, because if you want to kill the boss as fast as possible, you just cleave down Riban. You just, you don't focus it really. But if you want to win this dungeon and play it as safe as possible, you want to finish up Riban, just so nothing really can happen with jump from Riban and the frontal cleave that does do a lot of damage. And you want to be avoiding all of those tornadoes as much as possible. Even though Loda is probably going to be able to out-heal the damage over time effect that gets applied to you if you get hit by them, but you still just want to play it as safe as possible. And Buff War Nerf Rogue doing a good job. It really doesn't look like they're going to have any sort of trouble here at all, as they pop their Bloodlust right now, and they're going to be finishing off King Dastar, and they have an insane time here. Very clean by Buff War Nerf Rogue.
Yeah, important to mention as well, they do have 100% trash percentage on the tournament realm. Shadow of Azul doesn't give the 4% that he's supposed to give, but all the teams have been told that it does count towards that 4%. So they are at 100% trash percentage, and they aren't even going to use all 40 seconds of the Bloodlust. They're going to have 15 seconds to spare. As they said, a blazing fast 22:03 in this King's Rest.
Very well improved here. Buff War Nerf Rogue ties up the series in King's Rest to be pushing us into a game 3. That's definitely going to be a test of how well these teams are going to be able to execute in their strategies, because it'll be Shrine of the Storm. But before we talk about that, let's talk about this dungeon here, Tettles.
Yeah, that was a very swift, very clean run from both teams. Team D just had a few issues with how they ended up dealing with the bridge, but overall, Buff War Nerf Rogue really showing why they are in hot competition with Team D. So the first pull of the instance was this massive three-pack pull with using Bloodlust, which is very nice from them. And then something that's also very important is how they actually end up dealing with the Emissary of the Tides there. You actually see the Emissary of the Tides start off by getting sapped, and then Loda ends up spamming Entangling Root, allowing both of the groups to be able to kick the Hex Priests, because the Spectral Bolt can actually be very dangerous for the tank. Whereas on the opposite side, Team D here accidentally has that Emissary of the Tides end up getting inside the pack, because it doesn't end up getting like a root or a sap on it early enough, which forces the tank from the side of Team D to have to like kite and run away, and it makes them have just like many issues. And then beyond that, Buff War Nerf Rogue are just in the driver's seat after just those small mistakes that we actually saw from Team D, plus just the fact that Buff War Nerf Rogue was doing the front half of the instance just a little bit quicker with just a little bit higher DPS, and Buff War Nerf Rogue end up taking the match because of that.
And as a result, it's going to be having a tied-up series, so pushing us into Shrine of the Storm. We've seen both of these teams play very well onto Underrot and now King's Rest. Some of the dungeons teams have struggled massively on, so you're not going to want to miss this Shrine of the Storm. We'll be taking a quick break before we jump into it. The MDI will be back right after this. Buff War Nerf Rogue and Team D are all tied up as we're getting ready for our decider match to see who will go into the grand finals as we're kicking it off in Shrine of the Storm.
So, Shrine of the Storm, we've seen teams have a lot of problems in this dungeon, but we've also seen teams have problems in King's Rest. And Buff War Nerf Rogue, did not seem to struggle there at all. So I'm very excited to see what Buff4 and Nerf Rogue is going to do here. And of course, Team D actually won the time trials in Shrine of the Storms. They are the #1 team of the time trials with 23 minutes and 14 seconds.
Yeah, and it's important to mention as well that Buff4 and Nerf Rogue was not too far behind, only 30 seconds slower, but there was a huge drop-off afterwards. Team D, Buff4, and Nerf Rogue both had 23-minute times in that range, and then the third-place team had a 26.5-minute time. So, I mean, it's very clear just from the play in these last two dungeons how much of in a league of their own these two teams are in the Eastern region so far. But, I mean, hopefully they can show once again in this third match on stream, and maybe we can see an improvement again, because they already improved their Underrot time earlier by almost a full minute each. So to see an improvement in Shrine of the Storm as well would be very impressive from both teams.
Which is crazy to think about, that they improved their time trial time, because the time trials they played were actually before the rogue nerfs came in. So the fact that they improved their time, even though their damage got lowered because of the rogue nerfs, is very, very impressive. Now Team D, the difference in comp, of course, we have 3 rogues on Buff4 and Nerf Rogue side, and we have 2 yellow rogues and 1 green rogue on Team D side. So small difference in composition here, but I mean, maybe the utility added for Team D is actually going to be in their favor here, because we've talked about bolstering being a big issue here in this dungeon in general. And if you have a Ring of Peace to help kite a little bit once those mobs are bolstered and to interrupt a little bit and gather them more up, I think that might be an advantage for Team D here.
And also it makes sense as well that both teams have swapped off of the Unholy DK, because Unholy DK really does even damage to everything, and when you really want to be focusing more of your single target damage on the larger HP mobs, that's something you want to look for. But this looks very weird from Buff4 and Nerf Rogue. They've managed to pull Windspeaker Heldress, which is definitely not what they wanted to do. As Ching goes down, Marito and Tomboy also again, it looks like Loda and Supreme have hopefully ran away and are trying to shadow melt off the trash. That would be what I hope they're doing here, because you don't, I mean, this is going to be a full team away from them. Looks like they're still in combat, unfortunately. Yeah, that's really unfortunate from them. It looks like maybe they got too close to the trash mobs, or maybe mis-tab targeted. That's going to be very unfortunate from them. But steady course for Team D. They've got 16% trash percentage. They're now moving down to that same section of the dungeon that we just saw Buff4 and Nerf Rogue wipe in, and probably going to see something similar from them, where they pull that top trash on top of the stairs with these 2 Gale Caller apprentices into the cauldron so they can snap everything together and hopefully not accidentally pull Windspeaker Heldress. I mean, the problem with pulling Windspeaker is it's got those 4 initiates around it, right? And those have very little HP, so those are pretty much 4 automatic bolsters on everything else, which is times 1.2 mobs HP and damage, so exponentially increasing. That's over 2 times the health and damage, and I mean, you don't want to extend any pull in this dungeon by more than double.
Yeah, I really hope Buff4 and Nerf Rogue is not going to get disheartened by this huge mistake. Now, of course, they're going to be losing a lot of time, and if you think of how close those games have been between those two, this definitely means quite a lot. But Shrine of the Storm, again, it's a dungeon where anything can happen. We've seen 2 teams fight against each other before, where one team just had a complete disaster at the start of the dungeon, but then the other team had some mistakes too, and then it was just completely even at the end again. So if Buff4 and Nerf Rogue just keeps up and continues playing, there's definitely a chance that Team D does make some mistakes later on as well, just because bolstering just makes this dungeon so much more difficult.
Yeah, we've seen this strategy from a lot of teams where they're pulling Windspeaker Heldress into the boss. The one thing they really have to make sure they do here is they actually don't kill her while the boss is still out. They don't want to bolster the boss at all. That being said, the advantage of having Windspeaker on top of this boss is whenever she places that haste rune, similar to what happens later on in the second boss, you get a massive boost of haste, and it will just exponentially increase your single target damage, making this boss go by quicker. And on top of that, while the rogues can hit Blade Floor, they also do gain that little bit of single target damage as well. So this is all in all a good strat. We also saw a team in the West pull this strategy off. I can't remember off the top of my head which one it was, but once again, I mean, we see this a lot from the teams in the Eastern and Western regions, where they'll watch one of the other regions play and they'll be like, you know, I like that strat, we'll pick and choose, we'll take the pieces that we like and we'll put together a strat of our own. Team D definitely doing that here.
Yeah, we see Buff4 and Nerf Rogue finally committing their Bloodlust here to Aquas here as they pull the boss, and they also pull Heldress on top, as you mentioned, which, you know, I'm not sure if they came up with this themselves or if they copied this strategy. Either way, this is definitely working out for those teams. And Team D, they did use their Bloodlust at the very first pull of the dungeon, so theirs is going to be up a lot faster compared to Buff4 and Nerf Rogue, but we're only going to get, I believe it's going to be either 2 or 3 Bloodlusts. For Team D, probably 3. This dungeon usually is around the 23-24 minutes mark, so they definitely can get a third Bloodlust out. Buff4 and Nerf Rogue probably only going to get 2 because they did save their Bloodlust for a pretty long time at this point, as they saved it all the way until Aquaseer.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also a chance that they just never use the second Bloodlust and they save it for the final boss encounter, which is something we see a lot of teams end up doing as well. So just going to have to keep an eye on that going forward. That being said, Team D is now onto the intermission part of the fight, which is where, when the boss reaches 50 energy, he splits into 3 of his Aqualings, smaller versions of himself, and they all do the same mechanics. So really got to keep an eye on the HP of everyone in this phase. There's a lot of damage going out. You can see Uclap dropping quite low in this phase when he's only getting hit by the Aqualings. Keep an eye on his HP there. That's a little dangerous. But the third Aqualing does go down, and they'll just, finish off this last boss. 15% HP here.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure if I do like this whole Bloodlust on the last boss anymore, as I talked about earlier, because if you're gonna get 2 intermissions anyway, no matter if you use the Bloodlust or not, then I just feel like it's not necessarily needed, because execution-wise, the phase where you use the Bloodlust on is not actually a very difficult phase. It's all about pushing that damage. So if you're not gonna save an intermission phase, I just feel like there might be better usages of Bloodlust in general in this dungeon, and it's definitely not worth it to go with 1 less Bloodlust in the whole duration of the dungeon just to have it for this last boss. Now in the spring season it did make sense, because with the Bloodlust they managed to get only 1 intermission, and without the Bloodlust they didn't. So it definitely was a huge deal to save it back then. Now I'm not really convinced anymore, but we will see what those 2 teams are going to do with their Bloodlust later on, as Buffwar and Underrot still behind, of course, because of their huge team wipe that they had earlier on their trash, but they're about to down it, and now Team D already working on this next trash, as they have a double step here. Again, double step Trucity, so none of them actually getting combat with those mobs.
Interested to see what pull they're planning on doing here, because normally what we see from most teams is they will move in here and they will trick some trash out to their tank on top of the cauldron, snap it there, and they'll be able to AoE it down. But it looks like they're planning on skipping some trash here with a large Shadow Meld skip, or maybe they just only CC'd it so that they could move the Arcane Emissary away. And yeah, that's exactly what they did. They just CC'd so they could move the Arcane Emissary away, and now they're going to AoE these 7 trash mobs. All of them apprentices, so all of them have similar HP. And I mean, that was a very carefully crafted pull. There are some attendants in there that have less HP than everything else, so they have to keep an eye on those, make sure they're not too focused on them. One of them did go down already, which is 1 bolster on everything else, and that was at about 50% HP. The second one looks like they're doing just fine with their AoE cleave just now, so they're making sure they're evenly cleaving everything down. This is just kind of masterful bolstering management out of them. I like to see their play here.
Yeah, really well done by Team D. Now, sometimes even if something is very well planned and it looks like it for Team D, doesn't necessarily mean that this is the most efficient way, because the setup time that you need to get all those steps out, to get to the seed, to get the pull going on, get them pulled away from their emissary, this is all precious time that you do not spend doing damage. And all the time that you don't spend doing damage is very inefficient in those speedruns in general. But they pull it off very perfectly, and bolstering, again, one of those things, if you manage it properly, as you mentioned they did on this pull, it's definitely going to save you a lot of time. While Buffwar and Underrot did have 1 death on their way to this trash here, they did get a mass rest off, so they didn't have to commit a battle rest, but still, 6 deaths at this point.
Where is Runecarver? Did they deal with him?
No,
he was behind the corner.
Yeah.
Okay, that was interesting. So they kept him around the corner outside of bolstering range, and then they dealt with the attendants, and they're actually killing him for trash percentage. This is not something we normally see most teams do. This is honestly kind of a weird strategy, but hey, it works for the bolstering strategy. Team D, however, is pretty firmly in the lead right now. So just keeping an eye, I believe what we're going to see most teams do here is, okay, are they not skipping the Guardian Elemental? They're just pulling it with... Okay, this is completely different. I don't think we've ever seen someone kill the Guardian Elemental in the MDI before.
I don't think so.
Okay, that's new and exciting. You normally don't see teams pull either of these mini bosses because they're just not that efficient to pull. On the side of Buffwar and Underrot, they're doing. I mean, these guys are doing pretty much the same strategy. They're pulling a mini boss, and then once the mini boss gets to half HP or so, they're pulling trash on top of it so that they have pretty much the same amount of HP. Then they can just efficiently cleave everything down. Both teams doing the same thing, just at different points in the dungeon. This is like a really cool side-by-side image to see right now. I mean, they're doing the same strategy just with different mini bosses.
Yeah, I actually kind of like this, to be honest, coming out of Team D. Now, of course, it is a lot of AoE damage, and this is the reason why usually those teams don't want to pull this bridge elemental, just because it does so much AoE damage. But especially in this bolstering, I think it just seems like something you don't want to do. But they just first single target down the elemental, as you mentioned, and then they pulled the trash on top to just get very efficient uptime. And it definitely seems like if you don't have this elemental, it's so much easier for everyone to get back in case something does go wrong. And we've seen lots of times before that things can go wrong. So not having this elemental there on the bridge definitely makes coming back a lot easier. And now we're going to see the initiates. Hopefully they can deal with it very well because they are very highly bolstered here for Team D's side.
I mean, we've seen so many times this initiate pull go wrong for teams on the bolstering affix. It looks like they have a couple of pretty high initiates. There are only 3 left for Team D, whereas Buff War Nerf Rogue is just now killing their first set. So we'll see how efficient they are. Team D, it looks like they finished all of them off. That was pretty clean. Buff War Nerf Rogue, they've got a couple decently high ones. You got to remember, even though those bars are small, that could be a couple 100,000 HP, but it looks like everything is pretty low and they're going to be able to deal with them pretty efficiently. Very impressive bolstering management from both teams. I mean, it's just efficient cleave, so very well done.
I still wonder if it's even worth it to pull those initiatives in at all, because it seems like it's very little percentage and you're using a lot of time to finish them off just because of the bolstering. And no matter how perfect you play, you're always going to bolster them at the very end and you're always going to lose a little bit of time. So I kind of would have liked to see them skip the initiatives with like a shroud or something like that. There's some that you have to kill that are in the room of the boss, but there's some that you can actually skip on the bridge area. So maybe that's something they want to change later on if there's bolstering affix again. I hope not for them that there's any more bolstering in the future in this shrine, but maybe something the Western region will get later on. Now Buff War Nerf Rogue, they're still dealing with the trash here, while Team D is already fighting Brother Ironhall and Gale Colorfay.
Yeah, we had a really interesting POV there of Tomboy running over to the next pack that had the Enforcers with the Enchanted Emissary around it, and it looked like he pulled it on purpose, which he did do it on purpose. But I mean, if you don't know how that mechanic works, you kind of be questioning why he did that in the first place. The reasoning he did that is because he wanted to make sure that he got rid of as much mana from the Enchanted Emissary as possible. As a rogue, if you get in combat with it, then kind of kite it away for a little while, and then you vanish it off, it still stays in combat for about 8 to 10 seconds. So you can actually get rid of all of the mana of that Arcane Enchanted Emissary and just get rid of the Emissary on your own. So that was a great POV there from them.
Oh, I really like this. This is so smart by Buff War Nerf Rogue and also Team D doing the same thing as they're just jumping onto this ledge. This probably means, almost sure it means that those tornadoes are not going to hit them. So they can have all the tornadoes spawn in the world and they're just going to be saved there on top of this ledge as they don't go up there. So very smart play by both Team D and Buff War Nerf Rogue making use of this. Now, you can be like, oh, well, but you can just dodge them, so this is not actually going to help them too much. But yeah, it does help them a lot, because if you dodge the tornadoes, you lose damage. Even with Outlaw Rogue, if you have an increased range, you're still gonna be looking at the tornadoes, dodging here and there, and then you have to pay attention to where the wind stone is because that one speeds up the tornadoes. So just having to sit there without having to worry about those tornadoes at all is definitely going to increase their damage by a little bit.
Yep, and you can see there's a differing strategy here as well. Buff War Nerf Rogue is opting to just kind of evenly cleave these down as much as possible because they don't really care about Gale Colorfay. They can just interrupt as many casts as they want because the tornadoes can't reach them at all. So they can just full-on use that haste buff to their advantage as much as they want. Whereas on the other side of Team D, they've opted to cleave more trash down with Brother Ironhole once Gale Colorfay is dead. Now, because they did that and because they were a little inefficient with getting their trash together, Mach did end up proccing his cheat death and almost dying, but unfortunately they didn't have to expend any battle reses there. But it looks like Team D still has a little bit of an advantage due to that early wipe from Buff War Nerf Rogue, but it almost seems like Buff War Nerf Rogue is kind of closing the gap a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think they caught up quite a little bit here at this point. Now, it's still going to be 30 seconds difference because of those 6 deaths, and they also have to catch up in raw dungeon speed. But at this point, if Team D makes some sort of mistakes, which can happen on this exact very pull, we've seen this happen multiple times where teams pull 7 Enforcers, and then a tank just goes down because it runs out of defensives, or there's no slow or AoE utility coming out of the rest of the team. So we'll see how you manages this pull as they pull all of the Enforcers together.
And the important thing is at the start of that pull, they had to deal with that Arcane Emissary. And if I'm right, and we haven't seen it yet off screen because we didn't actually see the Arcane Emissary go away, but we'll see in a second here. If I'm right, Buff War Nerf Rogue will not have to deal with that Emissary at the start of this big pull that we see Team D pulling off, which means there's a little bit less setup time. And are we going to see... Is he right? Come on, camera. Let me see. Oh, it's still there, but it's going to have a lot. It's going to have a lot less mana, so it should go away a lot quicker. So Hopefully this emissary, you'll see it go away almost instantly, maybe 5 seconds after combat. There you go.
Oh, there we
Teleport
go.
right
Perfect.
away. And that was the reason for the rogue going there earlier. Pretty awesome strategy from them in general. Good routing. They don't have to worry about it at all during this trash pack.
Yeah, that's a very nice heads-up play. All those small little plays that we've talked about, specifically when we were talking about Method U and Method NA and why are they so good as they are, then we usually talk about those small little things that give you a couple of seconds here and there, which they're not those huge plays. They don't do those insanely huge pulls, but those small little things, they just add up and they save you so much time at the end of the dungeon. So really nice to see those kind of things coming out of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue as well. As they finish off this pack here, they get some bolstering done here, but you know, they're done with the pull and they're not that far behind in raw dungeon speed.
I mean, they dealt with that trash pack so much quicker than Team D did purely because of that Arcane Emissary play. And we're going to see them catch up and be on the same pack as Team D just because of that, because they planned in advance and they thought about what they wanted to do earlier on in the dungeon. Shadow Meld skip like we normally see through that room, and they're on the same pack. Team D only has it at about half HP on their side, so we're going to have to see if Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue is going to be able to catch up.
Yeah, one more thing I did like to note though is that the Enforcer pull was a little bit easier for Team D because they did have the Ring of Peace. So kiting was a little bit harder for Ching because you know, they have less AoE utility available for them because they don't have this AoE stun from the Monk, and they also don't have the Ring of Peace. So it made it a little bit easier for Team D to handle it. But now Team D is done with the pack and they pulled 2 of the bridge packs together as far as I'm aware.
They need to be very careful with that down Depth Ringer in the back that was just free casting. It was at half HP, and if they didn't interrupt it to come in, it could have bolstered up a lot. Fortunately, one of the rogues did kick it and move it in, so it's not going to be too big, but it was the last mob alive. It could have been pretty bad, but big safe play at the end, big save. And once again, they dealt with that trash pack a lot cleaner than Team D did there, but because they're lower on trash percentage in general, I believe they were 2% behind throughout most of the dungeon, and in that middle section of the dungeon, they are going to have to deal with this middle pack here, so they are still a little bit behind Team D in general, but man, they are catching up for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Team D has to deal with those 2 dwellers now. Now, one dweller pack, the right one, the one they're engaging right now, does have an Emissary of Tides in there. So no AoE stands, no interrupts for those lash casts, meaning that they're going to get a lot of damage here, especially if you get targeted by multiple lash casts in a row. But they're doing just fine as App is keeping the group alive. Now, once they deal with the left dweller pack, they're going to have enough percentage to be able to go to the boss and finish the rest of the trash in the last boss room. But Ching actually going down on the dweller pack here with the Emissary of Tides.
He got targeted by like literally every single lash. Nobody else's HP moved, and he just went 100 to 0 instantly. That is some of the worst RNG I think I've ever seen. That was rough. I mean, that's just an extra 5 seconds on the board that I don't think should happen. I mean, there are 16 of these dwellers, and there's 5 people in your group. To get targeted by every single one is just, I don't know, man. That sucks for them. That's pretty awful. Just an extra 5 seconds on the board. That being said, you know, the 35 seconds behind in the dungeon. So, I mean, Team D still has a very large advantage in the dungeon, but where they are in terms of in the dungeon, they're only 7% behind on the boss. And maybe, you know, I kind of want to go back to what we were talking about with Bloodlust on the final boss, because they have saved their second Bloodlust, like we mentioned there was a possibility of them doing. And I kind of feel with the triple Outlaw Rogue, you know, if 1 or 2 of them gets a 5 buff, you do have a shot at one phasing that boss. I mean, earlier today we saw Triple A get to 3%. I mean, there's a chance, right?
Triple A did have a DK though, and the DK was doing a lot of that, like, a lot more than the Rogues. So I don't think either of those teams can pull off the damage, just because if you want to pull off the damage on the last boss, I think it's possible actually, because we've seen a team go to 3%. So I definitely think it's possible to do it, but you need like a very specific comp for it to just burst single target damage. And let's be honest here, Rogues, they are not going to be the ones that, especially not if you run triple Rogue, in my opinion, you're not going to be the ones to burst it down unless you're insanely lucky and you get 5 buffs on all of them. So I don't think they're going to be able to do it, but we will see. Maybe they prove me wrong and just pop that Bloodlust and make sure that they only get 1 intermission. But if one of them, which of course I don't think is going to happen, but if one of them pulls it off and only gets 1 intermission, then they're definitely going to be winning the dungeon.
What do you think it would take to do it consistently? What kind of comp are you thinking?
I don't know. Probably a DK in there, just because they had burst so much with the Bloodlust going on, right? Yeah. And then maybe even a Holy Paladin. That probably does a lot more damage than the rest of it,
No,
right?
you're right. Holy Paladin would be be a massive amount of damage with that buff and wings and all that pop. That'd be pretty insane to see. Maybe even with the Arcana Trinket as well for the extra 3k. That'd be cool. I was thinking, maybe some Vision of Perfection class with some insane RNG, like maybe Boomy or even Demo Warlock getting 2 Tyrants off in that phase. That'd be pretty cool to see. But obviously, neither of those you're ever going to see an MDI play. We saw one Boomkin last cup.
Yeah.
We saw one, just one, and then we made fun of it the entire dungeon. So you never know. Stormsong is going down for both teams at almost the exact same time, maybe a 5-second difference. That being said, like we mentioned already, the 7 deaths on the board for Buff or Nerf Rogue put them pretty firmly behind. They would have to hope to either one-phase this boss while Team D didn't, or hope for a full wipe from Team D in order to win this dungeon. That being said, with the wipe they had... Abguts. That's another one for the compilation. Sours is out there still. Even though he's not here with us, he's still watching and making that YouTube compilation. I believe it.
We miss you, Sours.
We miss Sours, yeah. But I mean, that being said, it's still impressive that Buff or Nerf Rogue is coming back in this dungeon, and they're at the same point after having that full wipe. It just shows how good of a team they are.
No, I definitely agree. Like, very, very good showing by Buff or Nerf Rogue. And as you said, right, they had the full team wipe, and it cost them so much time in raw dungeon speed because they were in the middle of the pack. So when they had the full team wipe, all of the mobs reset, of course. So once they got the rest off, which also took a lot of time because they had to go back and Shadow Melt, then they have to engage the same pack again. So the fact that they're this close in raw dungeon speed to Team D is very impressive. And of course, we are in the upper bracket here, so Buff or Nerf Rogue losing to Team D does not mean that they're out. They're going to go down to the lower bracket, and they're going to have a chance to get into this upper final here today later on. So maybe we're going to see Buff or Nerf Rogue fight Team D again afterwards. But for now, we are engaging this last boss here, and things can still happen. If Buff or Nerf Rogue one faces the boss, there might be a chance they can still win, even with the 35 seconds.
I'm a huge numbers guy. When AAA got this boss at 3%, they had the boss at 77% for the first transition. So if Buff or Nerf Rogue gets him below that, I mean, there's a shot. Let's see. He's casting right now. They're at 77. Okay, 77. So they're going to have some insane 5-buff RNG to even have a shot, it looks like. Or Loda's going to have to pump out some huge numbers with that healer buff. I believe AAA's healer was doing like 80k single target DPS or something ridiculous like that. So we'll see if they can pull it off. Team D, on the other hand, they got theirs to 74%. So if they do the same damage AAA did, they might just one-face the boss on their own, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. I'm just because they definitely so the 3% that we saw earlier, they didn't bring the boss to lower than 80%, I believe, before they got it to 3% after the first intermission. So both of those teams doing more damage to the boss in the first phase, meaning that there's a chance that they can one phase it. Now, first though, before they engage the boss, both of those teams actually dealing with the trash pack here. Now they want to be careful that they're not bolstering the boss because those denizens, they actually do bolsters. They do bolster, sorry. The eels do not. So the eels, they can be pulled around on top of the boss, but these denizens cannot. So they want to make sure that they're 60 yards away from the boss to not get the boss bolstered, which definitely makes you lose if you do that.
Yeah, it looks like both teams are going to go for the similar strategy where they finish off all 100% of their trash count by pulling 2 eel packs as well before they engage the boss. Oh, spoke too soon. Team D just going instantly on the boss with their Bloodlust. And we're going to have to be able to... I mean, if Team D one faces the boss right now, the dungeon's over.
Yeah.
There's no way Buff or Nerf Rogue comes back. Keep an eye on that purple bar underneath the boss's HP. When that purple bar reaches 100 energy and fills up, the boss will do about a 5-second cast, which will put them into the next transition. So if they're able to kill this boss before that purple bar fills up, the dungeon is almost completely over. Did the staff proc for Loda? Oh my gosh, look at the damage Loda did. Did he just one-shot all the eels?
Yeah, he did.
Oh my god, that's insane. But I mean, the same thing rings true. They still have to one-phase this boss to have any shot, or they're going to have to hope for a Team D wipe. And Team D is absolutely obliterating this boss right now. 15% on the boss right now, maybe 75% energy. It looks like they're going to one-phase it.
They can do it.
I think they're going to do it.
Team D can actually do it. You can see how much damage everyone is doing. App is doing 60% single target, 60k single target DPS, and it's super. They're going to do it.
It's casting?
Yeah, they got
boss
it.
Goes down for Team D.
Wow.
One phases the boss. And all they got to do is finish off 2 wheel packs. That was incredibly impressive. And, on the other side, Buff or Nerf Rogue doesn't look like they were anywhere close to one phase of it, so we kind of hyped that up. But Team D able to do what no other team in any of the cups so far has been able to do in one phasing the boss with Bloodlust. Just goes to show the prowess of this team. They are that good.
that is so impressive just to get the first ever one face off, and it was close. He did start casting at the very end, but the insane amount of damage just to be able to pull this off and 0 deaths so clean by Team D.
Team D showing up and impressing there on that Shrine of the Storm. One phasing the boss, no death runs, going with a light speed onto that one. You love to see it, Titles. This team is really stepping up.
Yeah, both of these teams actually had pretty impressive runs in Shrine of the Storm. Buff or Nerf Rogue just have a few issues early on, but Team D being able to one phase that boss towards the end was very impressive. I think part of the reason is because they actually didn't pull the eels onto the boss. We actually see a lot of teams just kind of like looking to cleave the eels and just kind of passively do the boss because they're expecting to get an extra set or an extra cast, but Team D showing that you can actually one phase the boss is very impressive. It's also very cool. I thought this was very cool from both Buff War, Nerf Rogue, and Team D, how they're tanking the boss on top of this rock to where the melee can continue to get the haste buff, and they don't have to be dodging tornadoes. So standing outside of the arena like that allows you to just not have to dodge tornadoes. Buff War, Nerf Rogue, while Team D was actually pulling the boss, was just a little bit behind, doing some of their trash. They had a little bit of mishaps with some of their bolstering, so they could have cleaned up and like maybe saved a little bit of time there. But overall, Team D was just in the driver's seat based off just a couple mistakes that Buff War, Nerf Rogue had towards the very beginning of this instance.
You'd love to be able to start seeing that staff proc right at the very end onto that one, just to wipe out all of the eels. Ironic, that was so good.
I mean, we saw a better view there. We couldn't see the actual grasp cast for Team D from our POV there, so we didn't really even get close to finishing it. But still, I mean, the fact that Team D was able to one-phase that boss is pretty impressive.
Wow.
Incredibly impressive onto that one. So, Saddles, let's start talking about some of those earlier pulls, though. We had some interesting stuff coming out of these teams.
Yeah, so Team D actually was going to utilize a snap spot, and they were actually going to use this brazier, and they were going to pull these Tide Sage Initiates onto the snap spot. You actually see Tomboy right here running off to the side. He's going to be pulling these Tide Sage Initiates, snapping them towards this brazier where actually Ching is actually going to be jumping into, and they actually end up messing it up. So we can actually roll the clip, and we can actually watch and see what happens. So basically, Ching is in the snap spot. All of the mobs that they had already pulled are up there with them as well. You actually see Marito ending up snapping some of the attendants and stuff all the way off to the side. But unfortunately, Tomboy messes up his tricks or something ends up happening. The Tide Sage Initiates end up patrolling through Windspeaker Heldis, not snapping to him. And then basically once the mobs end up patrolling straight through it, they're social, and it ends up pulling Windspeaker plus the little initiate mobs, which basically once that happens, it's like a full team wipe. And that's the reason that Buff War, Nerf Rogue ended up losing this match, unfortunately for them.
It seemed like he almost moved out of the brazier a little bit too quickly onto that one because he had the wash away cast that they just didn't have an interrupt for. So he felt the pressure rather than getting potentially knocked off the cliff or something like that. He ran down, social aggro comes out everywhere, and it's just an absolute mess. So Team D moving on. We will start seeing them in the grand final at the end of the day. Buff War still has got another chance. They're awaiting the winner between our next series between Black Mamba and AAA, and this should be a very, a lot of NBA fans coming into this one's ironic. Other versions of sports are available, of course.
I'm all tapped out of sports games right now, man. I think I used them all up in that Siege of Barrels. So don't look at me for any. I got to go back and do some research on my break.
Oh, we will. We do have some breaks or some opportunity onto that one. So I mean, you're gonna have some time to be able to recharge onto this. But we're gonna need it.